Hello everyone, and welcome back to Classic Dune. Today I wanted to make a video talking about which factions you should swap out first with expansion factions. So, as you probably know, there are 6 factions in the base game, and these are fantastic factions. It's a great combination. It's really stood the test of time. For 40 years, this is all people had to play with, other than some more questionable entries. But now, we have the expansions to the 2019 edition that include 6 totally new factions. And since most players are still going to keep playing games with at most 6 people, the inevitable question is, which of these classic base game factions are you going to remove to swap in the expansion ones? Because the expansion ones are, in my opinion, just as good, if not better, than the base game ones. And I always like to play with at least one expansion faction in a game just to really shake things up and make it a game I've never quite seen yet. So, how do you determine this? Well, there's going to be a couple things to keep in mind. The first of these is going to be how familiar your table is with the game. So, you wouldn't want to include a more complicated faction like the Ixians or a harder faction to play like the Riches. So if you're a newer table, definitely avoid swapping these two out. The other very crucial thing to keep in mind is the economy factions. So the Tleilaxu, Chom, Emperor, and Guild, these are all what are known as economic factions in Dune. And as a rule of thumb, you want to always have in any game at least 1 or 2 economic factions, no more, no fewer. So you wouldn't, for example, want to swap out the Fremen for the Tleilaxu, and likewise, you definitely wouldn't want to swap out both the Emperor and the Spacing Guild for 2 factions that aren't economic factions. So that's very important to keep in mind. The game doesn't break if you ignore this rule, but it does become a little bit more weird with the spice economy. There's either way too much spice or way too little spice. And the other thing you want to think about when you're choosing which factions you're going to include in the game is the board state, the starting board state. So all 6 of these factions, with the exception of the Emperor, start on the board. And this, of course, varies wildly. I mean, the Bene Gesserit start with only 1 force on the board, whereas the Atreides, Harkonnen, and Fremen all start with 10. And the importance of this is trying to prevent early wins. So there's a lot of factions, not a lot, but there's 2 factions in particular, the Harkonnen and the Ixians, who are in very strong positions at the start of the game. They both have lots of forces on the board. They namely control a stronghold at the start, and they're also factions which generally do well in the early game. And if you include either the Harkonnen or the Ixians, you want to probably have the other, at the very least. Because since they're the 2 early game targets, they're going to naturally butt heads a little bit if either tries to go for the win. So if you got Harkonnen, definitely try to have the Ixians in there as well. Another good thing is Atreides. They themselves don't usually threaten early game wins, but they do work great as a counter to those early game wins because they start with a bunch of forces on the board in strongholds. The Fremen also help with this, but to a bit of a lesser degree, since they start out generally quite weak in the early game, even though they do start with a lot of forces on the board. And secondly, they also aren't focused on holding strongholds at the start of the game because, again, they're weak. They want to go up for spice as early as they can to be able to buy those cards and strengthen their board state. And then they'll be going for strongholds. But by that point, someone's probably already won if they're not there to be stopped. And another inclusion, a little bit more risky, is the Spacing Guild. So the Spacing Guild, if someone is going to go for an early win attempt, they're going to be shipping lots of forces probably. This will power the Spacing Guild up way earlier than normal, and they'll be able to stop that win attempt. The double-edged sword to this, however, is that the Spacing Guild, if there's no other significant power on the board, like the Harkonnen, like the Ixians, like the Atreides, the Spacing Guild can actually very easily go for a turn 1 win, especially in the advanced game where they can choose to just ship last and wait and see for everyone to screw up and leave strongholds open, and then they just go, they start with 2x, they jump into Carthag and move into Siege Tabor or Arakeen, and boom, uncontested win. So those are some things to keep an eye out for. Of the expansion factions that help with this are going to be the Mortani and the Ekaz. So if you have Harkonnen or the Guild in play and you choose not to have the Ixians or even the Atreides in play, these are two factions that are going to be great options for slowing down early game wins. So the Mortani get to start with 6 forces in any territory on the board that's empty, and that's going to typically end up being a stronghold, especially a city, since they have those ornithopters. And the Ekaz get to start with 6 forces in the Imperial Basin, which conveniently is 1 movement away from both of the most highly sought after strongholds. And these are the ones that are going to actually allow for a faction to catapult themselves into an early game win with those ornithopters. They'll be able to have forces in a stronghold and then move to another one. So the Ekaz will always be in a position to stop an opportunistic early game win attempt, because they will almost 9 times out of 10 involve Carthag or Arakeen. The Mortani and the Ekaz also conveniently start with 12 spice, which is the most on paper in the game, which means they'll probably be able to get some good cards and be able to ship some forces down onto the board even on the first turn. So they're good options to use. What you definitely want to avoid is having Harkonnen or Ixians alone, so only one of these two, and factions that are very weak in the early game or don't even start on the board. So like Rishes, Tleilaxu, Chom, Bene Gesserit. These are all factions that you want to reduce the amount of if you have Ixians or Harkonnen, because all 4 of these factions will have very minimal things they can do to stop them. However, as long as you have other weak early game factions with these 4, like Fremen or Mortani and Ekaz to a degree are not big early game contenders, so these are good options, or Emperor, and even Atreides, though it is going to be a little bit risky with such a passive set of other factions. So you get these 5, you stick in Emperor, Mortani, Ekaz, that'll make a pretty good, solid, balanced mix of factions for any given game. And as we all know, I mean, one of the biggest bummers in Dune is you spend however long, 30 minutes to even an hour setting up, and then the game just ends in 20 minutes on the first turn. That's just brutal. Nobody wants to see that. Now, another thing to keep in mind is how much information you have at the table. So this is primarily going to come down to the Atreides, the Ixians, and the Harkonnen, if either of these factions are included. So the Atreides, their main power is the ability to see the cards as they come up for bid and the ability to take notes. So the Atreides are going to have very good information on what cards each faction holds, although there will be some cloudiness with the fact that the starting pocket cards are unknown to the Atreides. And also the second card that the Harkonnen gets when they buy a card will also be unknown to the Atreides. So if you have Atreides in play, it's good to include either a Harkonnen or an Ixian. Harkonnen for the reasons mentioned, and an Ixian also because they have perfect knowledge on every card in the game. They just don't know who has them. They also don't get to take notes, so it's up to them to remember. The other thing is that they also manipulate the cards coming into play. So every turn during bidding, they're going to take the number of cards that would go up for bid plus 1, and they choose one to suppress, either to the top of the deck or to the bottom of the deck. So the Ixians can be great to really mess with the Atreides, not mess with their knowledge directly, but mess with what the Atreides ends up knowing by controlling what cards go up for bid and consequently what cards the Atreides see. They do have methods of screwing with the Atreides' knowledge by using their technology advantage. So when a card goes up for bid, before anyone bids on it, the Ixians can choose to take a card from their hand and replace it and take that card that was going up for bid before the Atreides even look at it. So that's going to add a lot of hidden knowledge to the game. They also have the alliance ability where when their ally buys a card, the ally can choose to discard it face up and just take the top card of the deck secretly. That's another way to enter cards into the game without the Atreides seeing them. So these three factions here have kind of a tug of war against each other in terms of how much they disrupt the other faction. The Ixians will also disrupt the Harkonnen a great deal, because since the Ixians choose what the top card of the deck is, they can make sure that the Harkonnen are always buying bad cards by just saying, oh, hey, look at that worthless card or cheap hero. I'm going to put that on the top of the deck, and now I know that when the Harkonnen buy a card, that's the card they're going to get. So these are all a good way of making sure that you have a fairly balanced mix of factions when you're playing this game, because your faction mix is going to be a huge determinant of how the game plays. It can be wildly swingy if you have lots of economic factions, very little economic factions, how many information-related factions you have. It's a personal favorite of mine to have a game with no information factions, just because it really speeds up the bidding phase, and it also means that any card is just as valuable as any other card, so why not just bid on them? You'll get some crazy things where someone bids 10 spice and it ends up being a worthless card. Or, you know, it just goes for 3 spice and it ends up being the poison blade. It's hilarious, and you never really know what's going to come out of the deck at any given time. Another thing to keep in mind is you probably want to minimize the number of factions that interact with the bidding phase. So that's going to be the Rishes, the Ixians, the Atreides, and again, to a degree, the Harkonnens. These are all factions that screw with the bidding phase in different ways. These three for reasons I've mentioned, and the Rishes also for their ability to intervene and sell one of the Rishes cash cards once per turn, and then also the ability to sell a card from their hand in place of a normal bid. That's their black market ability. So these guys can really cause a lot of shenanigans, and there's going to be a little bit of confusion on when the Ixians use their ability and when the Rishes use their ability, and just the Atreides, you know, pulling their hair out trying to figure out who has what, and the Harkonnen just giving everyone a headache in their typical Harkonnen ways. So those are all the things you want to keep in mind when you're choosing what factions are in play. And this is going to be most applicable if you are at start kind of choosing, okay, we're going to play with these 6 factions, and maybe even determining who's going to play which faction. I think you should play them, you're going to get them, so on and so forth. And I think this typically is going to happen in newer player games where you have one person who's more familiar with the game and is going to be trusted to say, okay, I think if you want to have a good time, you should probably play this faction, and we're going to exclude these factions. It does also come into play, though, if you have some sort of drafting method on which factions you're going to include and which faction you're going to play. If everyone's experienced with the game, you will all hopefully know these things, especially if you watch this video, and you'll be able to say, hey, someone's already picked the Chom and the Tleilaxu, so we probably shouldn't choose another economic faction like the Guild or the Emperor in this game, unless we want to go really crazy. Or, on the opposite end, hey, I'm the last to pick, and nobody's picked any economic factions, so I should probably choose at least one just to keep things a little bit balanced. So that's my take on all the tips to keep in mind when you're choosing which factions to include in the game. There's 12 wonderful factions here, and the biggest shame is that unless you're crazy and you got 11 other crazy people, you can't play a game with all of them at the same time. So that's going to do it for today. Until next video, I'll catch you guys later.